You're listening to Romancing in Paris on Paris Underground Radio.
Hello, and welcome to the Romancing in Paris podcast. I'm your host, Lily Heise. In this podcast, we'll be traveling around the city as I pick out my top romantic spots per arrondissement. You don't have to visit these places only as a couple. Exploring them can be the expression of your own love of Paris. Are you ready to get romancing in Paris? Hello, and welcome back to Romancing in Paris. So for today's episode, we're going to do something a little bit different. Some regular listeners of the podcast might recall we've had a special guest the past few seasons. And today I'm very happy to welcome today's special guest. It is Dr. Susan Taylor-Leduc of Picturesque Voyage. Susan has been on the show before to talk to us about the Château de Malmaison and as well to talk about the Parc Monceau. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, go back and have a listen to them. And I'm very happy to welcome Susan today because Susan has just published a new book, which she's going to tell us about, Marie-Antoinette's Legacy. So we'll hear more about that from Susan. But Susan is going to be talking to us about the star of her book and one of her key specialties, and that is Queen Marie-Antoinette. So we're going to travel over to Versailles and also hear some of the wonderful insight Susan has to share on the topic. So welcome back to the podcast, Susan.
Thank you so much, Lee. It's a pleasure to be back, especially to talk about such a iconic French queen that everybody wants to learn more about.
Exactly. It's such a fascinating topic. And as you and I have discussed, there have been a few new TV episodes and some other things on Marie-Antoinette that aren't always accurate.
They're not accurate at all, but they tell a good story, but they're not accurate. But, that's part of the attraction of Marie-Antoinette, I think. She had a short reign and a tragic destiny, and I think that that's a constant subject of interest. And so people can fabricate many stories over the years, since her death, actually. And whatever historical moment it happens to be takes another kind of take on the queen. And so now we're in a moment of great sympathy for her, but it wasn't always so. But at this point, I think that it's important to try to balance what we know about the historical record with the mythologies and the number of stories that are popularized about the queen.
Okay, well, fascinating. Well, thank you very much. So, before we travel virtually to Versailles, why don't you tell us a little bit about your new book? It would be wonderful for our readers to know a little bit more about it.
Well, my book, which is just published by Amsterdam University Press, is called Marie-Antoinette's Legacy, The Politics of French Garden Patronage and Picturesque Design. And the book begins by telling the story of Marie-Antoinette at Versailles, which we'll talk about more in greater detail, and particularly her decision to become a garden patron at the Petit Trianon, which was certainly one of the most romantic places at Versailles. And what I show is that while the queen was an exceptional garden patron, and she very much was launching a new style, and she used her garden not only as a place to be interested in garden patronage, because that was an incredible luxury in the 17th and the 18th centuries, particularly for women, but also she used it as a way to create her own kind of clientage systems, but also to launch her fashion, to launch her love of perfume and cosmetics and all kinds of things that she was extraordinarily influential at that time. So the garden was a very special place for her. And you would think that after her death at the guillotine in 1793, in October 1793, that there would be such disdain for her with the French Revolution that no one would ever want to go back to the garden. But in fact, very quickly it became a tourist attraction, and they set up kind of a guignette, a place where you could have drinks outside and take a walk through the garden. And then 6 years later, Josephine made Malmaison, which we've talked about before, kind of an emulation of the queen, because being a garden patron became a really important way for empresses, and Josephine became an empress in 1804, to manifest their power. So I talk about what happened to garden history during the Revolution, her influence on Josephine, and then when Josephine is divorced, her influence on Marie-Louise, who was Napoleon's wife, who went back to the Petit Trianon. So all these things that seem very strange to us, like how could these women go back to this place that were scarred by the memory of, a guillotine queen, means that these women at this particular moment still found meaning in this garden. And then for a while in the 19th century, the royal family during the Bourbon Restoration in the first half of the century doesn't go back there. But Eugenie, who becomes empress in 1853, has an incredible passion for Marie-Antoinette and models herself after her and restores both Malmaison and the Petit Trianon. So this legacy aspect is trying to understand why the queen had meaning for other female garden patrons from the 18th century until throughout the 19th century.
That's fascinating. Wow, I can't wait to read the whole thing. I've read a little bit, but nice to sit down perhaps in the lead up to the nicer weather returning and to then go and imagine some of the topics which are brought up in the book actually on site. So
absolutely.
Yeah, well, we could go together. Would be me. Susan gives wonderful tours as well. And so, speaking of traveling somewhere, today we're going to virtually journey out to Versailles with you and to talk a little bit more about Marie-Antoinette, her time there, and a little bit of romance. So that's going to be a little bit more focus. So I'd love to hear from you, Susan. How did Marie-Antoinette come to France, and a little bit about her relationship with the future Louis XVI. So any insight you have on that would certainly be of interest to our listeners.
Well, I think that it's important to understand that this was an arranged marriage. This means that it was primarily a diplomatic and to a certain degree financial transaction. So when the Empress of Austria, Marie-Thérèse, decided to marry her youngest daughter to Louis XV's grandson, Louis XVI. This was a major upheaval, but she was actually a child bride, what we would consider to be a child bride. She was 14 years old. So when she arrives at Versailles in 1770, she really is, although she's been educated and she has some difficulty speaking French, but she knows how to speak French. She's been educated at the Austrian court. From 1770 until 1774, she has the position of being a dauphine, which means that she's kind of like the queen in waiting, but she does have a situation of rank. And it's during that time that she gets to see how other people are navigating social etiquette. And one of them is the mistress of Louis XV, Madame de Dubarry. And Marie-Antoinette is young and she's been brought up in Austria, and she's quite horrified that this 60-year-old man is having an affair with someone 30 years younger and used to be a prostitute. And she's like, I don't want to be friends with this woman. I want to be my own self. But she learns something. She learns that the Queen of France or a mistress can have an enormous amount of power. And she decides that she's going to have that kind of power. So as soon as Louis XV dies, Dubarry is chased from court and the queen takes over. And she basically says, I've been trying and I've been learning for 4 years, and now I'm going to do things as I like. And one of the things that she does is she immediately asks to have the Petit Trianon. So she does two things right away. She sets up private apartments for herself in Versailles. So right behind the Galerie de Glace, there's her bedroom, and right behind her bed, which is the bed where she's supposed to give birth to her children, and all the queens of France do, are two secret passages. And it's those secret passages that go to her private apartments, and also stairways that led to the king's apartment so that she could visit the king in privacy. Because these two young people who are married at age 14 have a terrible time consummating their marriage.
Oh, dear.
And so for 7 years, the queen is not pregnant. And queens of France are supposed to be, their one job is to make sure that there's a male heir. And so this is really very difficult because there's the threat that she'd be sent back to Austria, although that really doesn't ever happen. But finally, her mother is so upset that she sends her son, Marie-Antoinette's brother, over to explain to Marie-Antoinette and Louis XVI how things work in the bedroom.
Oh, my.
And finally,
Really?
their marriage is consummated. It could have been that he had a physical problem, but finally she then gives birth to 4 children, and not all of them will survive. But she then fulfills her role as Queen of France. So that's important that she becomes a mother, and that there's 2 sons that are born, and so 2 future heirs. At the same time, once she kind of assumes the status, she's able to develop spaces for herself. And in so doing, she creates private spaces at Versailles behind her public apartments that are linked by a series of secret staircases to the king's apartments. Also, secret staircases that lead to her children who are not in the same spaces as her. And then the real thing that she does is develop the Petit Trianon as her own domain.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So the Trianon, just so that we're all clear, there's the main palace at Versailles, and there are the gardens, and the Trianon itself is a separate palace complex. Could you tell us just a little more about that, and then lead in as well to how the Petit Trianon was created?
Yes, so the Grand Trianon was actually created by Louis XIV, and it was a place, it's 3 kilometers from Versailles, and it was supposed to be kind of a retreat from the ceremony of court when it got too crowded. And it was also a place where Louis XIV would go to entertain his mistresses.
Ooh.
Because the idea of having a mistress was really established by Louis XIV, who had several. And he gave kind of the mistress at court an official place, an official title. And these were women who wielded great power and benefited from the king's generosity. They also had children, some of whom were acknowledged by the king and were given property and great honor. So the Trianon itself was first created for Louis XIV's mistresses. The Petit Trianon was created by Louis XV, and it was something that he developed as also a place of retreat so that he could get away with his mistresses, first in the little Pavillon Français, which is a jewel of 18th century architecture, which was really a place where he would rest after he'd been on the hunt or was working in the garden, because he was quite an extensive gardenist, horticulturalist interested in botany.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he was very interested in botany. And then he created a botanical garden, an extraordinary botanical garden at Versailles. And then at the Petit Trianon, he decided he wanted something better than this just little resting place. And so he created for himself, but also probably for his mistress, Madame de Pompadour. But Madame de Pompadour died before it was completed. And this was a larger pavilion, the Petit Trianon, that included a dining room, bedrooms, and reception spaces, but much more intimate than the Grand Trianon, and certainly much more intimate than Versailles. So the woman who was able to benefit from that was Madame du Barry. And Madame du Barry was able to, his second mistress, from 1770 until 1774, who Marie-Antoinette had kind of watched in action as a young adolescent. And as soon as Louis XV died, Marie-Antoinette said, I want that for myself. And she kicked out the Madame du Barry, and she took over the Petit Trianon for herself.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it was this kind of place of retreat then for her.
Certainly it was a place of retreat for her. It was a place that Louis XVI, although he did not actually give it to her in name, he kind of lent it to her and said, you can do what you want and you can use it, kind of what in legal terms would be usufruit, that you would benefit from it. But she went a little step further and she said, I'm going to control who gets to actually visit me here and what kinds of activities go on here. So that was very insulting to courtiers who really wanted to be in her entourage. And she said, no, I only want my friends in my entourage and the royal family. And so she kind of created this place, used the Petit Trianon for getaways. You know, she would often come back to the chateau at night, but she used it for the development of her garden, for theatrical performances. And then later she expanded it to the hameau, which is a fake kind of village that she used to educate her children about husbandry and agriculture, and also used it as a place to enact kind of comic operas. It was a place of retreat. It was actually a place that she got to use as like a power center.
Ah,
for her own identity politics out there.
Okay. And so if you were invited there, it was quite more of an honor too. I imagine that meant you had a certain status or a relationship then with the Queen.
Absolutely, because you got to be close to the Queen in a way that couldn't at court. And it really was much smaller. So as a result, the number of people there, just like in her private apartments in Versailles, was very restricted unless she opened it up for special occasions, festivities when her brother Joseph came, or when there had to be diplomatic occasions. She sometimes gave parties there. Then it would be a little bit more open. But it was certainly kind of a much more private place. And it was precisely because it was more private that it became kind of a place where those who were not invited became envious and quite gossipy and slanderous about what she was possibly doing there. So it became a place of rumor. And just because when you don't know what's going on behind closed doors, and in one of the rooms, she actually sets up movable mirrors so that you really can't see inside. It's
Wow.
And so that what was she doing behind closed doors? And that was a great question of gossip, particularly for those who weren't invited.
I see. Wow, that's fascinating.
If you're enjoying this episode of Romancing in Paris, you may be interested in our sister podcast, Don't Miss This. It comes out every Sunday and has a fabulous roundup of the best and coolest events taking place in Paris during the week. Romancing in Paris will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now back to Romancing in Paris.
I can also see then how those rumors got a bit out of control over the years, kind of in the build up to the revolution.
Yes, and one of the ways that they got out of control was that Marie-Antoinette had an intimate relationship with a Swedish noble and army officer whose name was Axel von Fersen.
Ooh, tell us more about this.
Yes, well, she met him while she was incognito at a masquerade ball in 1774 at the Opera, which is not the Opera of today, but another opera house. And it is often said that this was a kind of love at first sight and that they had an intimate relationship, although it's very difficult to understand exactly what happened between them. I think it's important to understand that the Queen's life was quite under surveillance, and it wasn't as if she could just, because her main duty was to create a son for the monarchy, the fear of having an illegitimate child was overwhelming. So she was very much surveyed. But I think that with Fersen, there was clearly some kind of affair. Was it consummated at the Petit Trianon? I don't know if we'll ever know. He was extremely loyal to her. It was he who helped try to arrange the Flight de Varennes during the revolution to try to get the royal family out of France.
Wow.
He tried desperately to save her while he was unbelievably committed to her, surely in a romantic way. We do have letters between them that were written in code.
Oh, wow.
So there's a lot of curiosity about their relationship. What is clear is that he tried everything to try to save the Queen, not successfully, obviously, but his love for her and his commitment to her and his loyalty to her was really unsurpassed. He did not die until 1810. Their letters have been published, but most of them date from the 1790s. And we think that if there were really passionate love letters, they would have been in the 1780s, and those we don't have.
Okay, maybe, yeah, they were burnt or something like that.
They must have been destroyed, yeah.
Yeah. Ooh, what a shame. Wouldn't that be exciting if they were discovered one day?
Well, there are people who are very convinced now that, that this was her lover and she had this private life, and that could be true, but it's equally true that, she had a life that had a certain amount of protocol, even at the Petit Trianon, and that she had sympathy for Fersen is without doubt, and his loyalty to her is quite remarkable. and with a certain kind of desperation at the end of please do anything to try to save her, which was impossible and during the Reign of Terror.
Susan, that's really amazing. So who knows, maybe one day we'll find out the favorite loves romantic spots between Marie Antoinette and her chéri.
Yeah, perhaps.
But if individuals would like, regular commoners would like to visit Versailles today, if couples are going to Versailles, can you give us a few suggestions on perhaps some of the more romantic spots at Versailles or some of the ways that one could have a special romantic trip to Versailles?
Well, I think that the most romantic part of Versailles, even in the 17th century, were the gardens, because the gardens were divided into the straight promenades that they're famous for. But there are little wooded areas called bosques, and each of them, many of them have fabulous sculptural and fountain displays, but there are all kinds of little winding paths and woods. And each of these little kind of miniature wood areas, these bosques. And these were places of intimacy in the 17th century. These were places that are today still very romantic because they're shaded, there's water, there's music. And I think that visiting the bosques, certainly during the days when the water is playing, evokes the fact that Versailles was a very crowded place, and the only place that you could really go was to retreat to the garden. So on the one hand, just visiting the bosques is a romantic place. And then obviously going to the Petit Trianon is one of the most romantic places because it is 3 kilometers away and so small in scale. And you can imagine Marie Antoinette's family and her closest friends and Axel von Fersen retreating there and having intimate dinner parties and whatever might have been going on in the kind of bedrooms up on the 3rd floor. That's a very special tour to see those rooms that are really closed to the public. But the gardens at the Petit Trianon, which are called the Gardens of the Queen, are also kind of very spectacular swirling paths that were meant to induce surprise and be very secretive. And there's a secret grotto. And I think those are places for romantic encounters. And then probably the Hameau itself, which is really a world within a world. And you don't feel like you're at Versailles anymore. It really feels like you're in a stage set, a comic opera, a beautiful, idealized village. And I think that has a certain charm that appeals to everyone who visits Versailles, even today.
That sounds amazing. So I agree, these bosques are really charming and really magical places. Visitors do need to take note that the bosques aren't open every day. So the bosques are only open if there is a jardin musical or a grand zone musical. These special opening days. So if you are planning this nice romantic trip to Versailles, I recommend you check the website to ensure that the bosques or groves in English are going to be open, and those are on the musical fountains and the grand fountain days. So be sure to keep that in mind when you're planning your trip.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's open more than it used to, but usually in high season by November 1st until I think April 1st, they're closed.
Yes. So, and it's still nice to go to Versailles at that time because fewer people are going. And so
you can still go into the Bosquet or around some of the paths. Certainly you can go into the Jardin de la Reine.
Oh, great. And yeah, I have spent less time there. So on my next time back to Versailles, I'm going to keep that in mind. So fantastic. So Susan, you know so much about Versailles because this is one, in addition to Marie-Antoinette, Versailles is one of your specialties. You give tours at Versailles as well, don't you?
Yes, I do. I give tours at Versailles, and they can be the general introduction to Versailles. Thank you so much for mentioning it. Or a Marie-Antoinette tour, or a half day or a whole day. And then there are these very special and quite expensive ability to book 3 months in advance to see some of these private apartments and secret passageways. The apartments of Madame de Pompadour, Madame du Barry, and of Marie-Antoinette have all recently been restored. It just takes a lot of extra planning to make those visits possible.
Well, if someone is planning in advance and has an extra special occasion, then it could be.
Absolutely.
Yes, it could be wonderful. And they should reach out to you if that's the case. Susan's website is picturesquevoyage.com, and you can find more information about Susan's tours at Versailles and in Paris. She has a variety of tours in Paris. Susan is exceptionally knowledgeable and engaging. I speak from personal experience, and so
That's very kind.
if you're looking for an in-depth tour that you're really going to learn a substantial amount on, change your perspectives of Paris, I recommend Susan's tours.
Thank you so much. And perhaps change your perspective on Marie Antoinette too.
Exactly.
It's hard to get away from the myth, but it's necessary to look at the complexity of the period as much as the beauty, I think.
That's fantastic. Very good insight. And Susan's book, Marie-Antoinette's Legacy, is now available, and you can find more information about that on Susan's website.
You know, I'm more than happy to share my knowledge, and thank you so much for speaking about it. I do think that it's important to understand the role of women at Versailles. It's sometimes hard for us to think that there should just be a king and a queen, and that there were so many other women at Versailles. But in fact, you know, this was the way that women were able to exert power at that time. And so when we think about women in power today and women in power then, I think it's important to understand the context of what it was like to be at court and how that has some way still influences the way we perceive women today.
Very good point. Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Susan, and I look forward to finishing reading your book and to having you back as a guest. We have a few other topics we would like to discuss. So every season, it's wonderful to have you back and to hear your fabulous insight.
Thank you so much, Lily.
Wishing you all the best until next time you're on the podcast.
Thank you for listening to this latest episode of Romancing in Paris. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. That way you won't miss the next one. Ratings or reviews get a big je t'aime from me. And if you would like to discover more romantic places in Paris, see my website, jetaimemeneither.com. This podcast was produced by Paris Underground Radio. Check out their website if you're interested in listening to more great podcasts on Paris. In the meantime, happy romancing in Paris.
This episode of Romancing in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.